The music scene in Santa Cruz and Monterey just keeps getting better. And every Thursday on KSQD between 1 and 3, the New Squid in Town Music Show tells you who's at the clubs throughout the Monterey Bay, and then we play their music. Sometimes the bands even stop by or call in. So tune in to what's happening locally and nationally in live and recorded music every Thursday between 1 and 3 with me, David Bean, only on the New Squid in Town, KSQD Santa Cruz. This is David Bean, host of New Squid in Town on K-Squid, letting you know that the hottest ticket on Saturday, March 2nd will be Tammy Brown, Heath Greninger, Coy Rogers with Carolyn Sills and Gerard Egan, Andy Furman, Coffee Zombie Collective, the Coast Ridge Ramblers, Rapadian Rose, Ben James, and Lucas Lawson and the Unturned Stone. All at Squid Fest West, a K-Squid fundraiser at the Resource Center for Nonviolence in Santa Cruz on Saturday, March 2nd from 1 to 5. There'll be a silent auction at the event. You can find out more online at ksqd.org. Tickets at eventbrite.com.
That's right. Just look Squidfest West up at eventbrite.com or go to our website. We have a button there that goes straight to the ticket window. And just added was Anthony Aria. So great lineup. Hope to see you there. And it will now help with our Dried Squid Flood Relief Fund that will help us with the extra staff time it's taking to navigate the situation in which we find ourselves, a little squid swimming amidst the flood. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman. This is Talk of the Bay, and joining me here in our studio is Nolan Higdon. Nolan is a professor at UC Santa Cruz. He studies media studies as well as fake news, something we all could learn something about. Welcome, Nolan. Thank you for being with us here on Talk of the Bay.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. You've done a lot of interviews about this, and I imagine they all have some of the same questions, but tell us briefly what the latest fake news or fake deep fake has been so far recently. We're in the primary season now. We've seen a couple of things go by. What's your take on how sophisticated these things are and what effect they are having thus far in our election season?
Oh, well, thank you very much again for having me, and wonderful to be a part of such a great program. I think in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen an acceleration in technology, which has accelerated the sophistication of fake news. And as you already alluded, I think what's different about this election cycle, say between the previous handful, is how much more advanced AI has gotten, and this has allowed deep fakes to be created and spread quite easily amongst a lot of the population. And so I think that's a big difference. And we really started to see the effects of this, I think, during the war between Israel and Gaza, where videos were being produced of horrendous things, and they were false, but they were being spread around the internet and believed quite widely. And to your point about the election, we're already starting to see that sophisticated technology enter the electoral realm. I think one of the most recent examples that's fresh in my mind was the robocall that was going around of Joe Biden's voice telling people not to vote in the New Hampshire primary. If you listen to the call, it sounded a lot like Joe Biden, even the way he takes his pauses and his sentences. And that's what AI can do. It can convince you're listening to someone or seeing something that isn't true. And for as bad as 2016 and 2020 were, the AI technology was nowhere where it is now. So I think we're at a much more advanced state in terms of fake news, and that's why there's a lot of concern amongst those of us who care about truth and veracity and democracy, and how much of this fake information is going to shape the way people participate in this election.
Maybe we should define deep fake for people and tell a little bit about A, how it works, and B, how accessible it is to kind of the average person.
Yeah. So deep fakes are some sort of media content that is, digital media content that is created with somebody's likeness. It could be a sound, it could be a visual of them. And it's basically like any other video you would watch. It looks very realistic. Some of the more popular versions of this, there was a video going around that portrayed Nancy Pelosi as being drunk at a speaker podium. And it was pretty convincing. There was another one of Barack Obama throwing insults at Donald Trump. That was also pretty convincing as well. And now a lot of these, thanks to smart technologies and advancements in AI, you can really make these from your home. And thanks to social media, you can post them and people can share them, and they can spread quite quickly. And I want to make sure it's also, listeners know, it's not just visuals, it can also be audio as well. For example, one of the things they've done over at like Joe Rogan's podcast, Joe Rogan will create, absurd like AI podcasts where it'll be a, celebrity figure like the Hulk Hogan or something talking to Donald Trump. And you can listen to a whole podcast and it's pretty convincing. It sounds like you're hearing Hulk Hogan and Donald Trump have a conversation, but neither of them ever participated in the conversation. So these things have gotten really advanced. And one of the things I recommend to internet or digital users is we should disabuse ourselves of this notion seeing is believing. Seeing isn't believing anymore. We need to do a lot more investigative work with what we see.
The average person can't possibly be expected to detect this stuff with the fire hose of all kinds of information, fake and otherwise. So do we just turn it all out? I mean, what is your advice for people who can't possibly determine if something is fake or not now that it's as sophisticated as you say?
Well, I think healthy skepticism is really important. And this goes not just for deepfakes, but using the internet in general. Our internet experiences are curated by the platform decides what to show us in, say, a Google search or a social media feed. We have some influence on that with, who we like, follow, and subscribe to. But that's a curated experience. It's not access to endless, boundless information. So I think we need to remind ourselves when we sit down to the internet, there are many forces on the other side of the screen trying to shape our opinion and views of things. So healthy skepticism about what we see is incredibly important. Closely related to that, I would encourage people to try their best to suspend judgment. Just because you read something or saw something doesn't mean you immediately need to comment on it or use it as evidence to make some point to someone else. You may get in the situation where you see something false, and by commenting on it, you give it legitimacy, and so you help spread false information. So try to resist that urge to comment, share, like on things immediately, because you may be helping spread false information.
This just in from the Monterey Herald, our local paper here. A respected former Central Coast Senator, Bill Monning, has thrown his weight behind a new initiative that claims to combat disinformation generated by artificial intelligence ahead of future elections. Emeritus Bill Monning, who represented Central Coast, District 17, and Assembly District 27, 4 years prior, has joined the ranks of a new nonpartisan group focused on solutions to the threat AI has on America's system of elections. And to that end, they're going to join a nonprofit called the California Initiative for Technology and Democracy of Common Cause. It's trying to hold these institutions accountable. I'm not exactly sure how they're going to go about this, but it sounds like, better late than never.
At some point, I'm glad to see people pay attention to the issue. And I think that was one of the part of this, I guess, small light in the darkness of the electorate. He popularized this phrase fake news, and it drew attention to the ways in which false information is spread under the guise of journalism online. So people paying attention to it, I think, is great. But we've seen a lot of problems with the solutions that are proposed. So, having people from, industry, especially the tech industry, get involved in the solutions, that raises a red flag for me because the way they've designed platforms like social media platforms or Google searches actually privileges false information over true information. And we've seen time and time again, thanks to whistleblowers, that when industry has a chance to either stop the spread of some false information or not. They ultimately decide whether or not to, depending on profits. And if it's not profitable to stop false information, they will allow it to continue. So their motives are suspect, and ditto goes for a lot of people in government. All governments create and distribute propaganda, including the United States government. So they have a conflict of interest in engaging in this problem in terms of censorship. Now, the solution that I've proposed, and I think this could involve all parties, is to recognize, and this is what my book, Anatomy of Fake News, is about. Fake news has existed forever. It's never going to go away. One of the greatest things about being human is that we can imagine, we can tell stories, and we can make things up. And this is how we create myths and films and entertainment. But that also means we can totally believe falsehoods as well. And so if we try to get rid of false information, I think we're setting ourselves up for failure. A much better solution is to equip people with the skills to be able to analyze the content they encounter to make determinations on their own about the veracity of content, rather than have people from industry or government who have conflicts of interest making determinations about what we should and shouldn't see.
Well, I might wonder about the government piece, because places like in Europe have started to regulate things like Facebook. There's states trying to do it. And I understand the dangers there, that you're worried about censorship, in the wrong hands. These things could be picking and choosing what type of politics you want people to see. And it's already kind of doing that with the algorithm, which is even more ham-fisted of a way to skew things. So I want to talk about that in a minute, but let's stay for a moment with what can government do that wouldn't step on freedom of speech, but might actually protect us from these super sophisticated deep fakes. I mean, it's one thing to have a news story with an old photograph that didn't actually happen with that story. It's a whole other thing to impersonate someone with technology that the average person really can't be taught to discern.
No, and I agree on that. I don't think government is completely useless. But when it comes to making, determinations about what information people can and can't see, I mean, there's a whole history of problems there. But to your question, I think there's a lot they could do. I think one is putting money and funds behind requiring media literacy education, and money to train teachers to teach about media literacy education is something that government can do. I think that these big tech platforms we call like the FANGs, the Facebook Metas, the Apples, the Alphabet Googles, Netflix, et cetera. I think a lot of these big companies need to be broken up. They simply have too much power. The very fact that a lot of us have conversations about whether or not Facebook should censor this content or that content, that speaks to how much power they have, that we're turning to them to do the things we traditionally did through the ballot box. And closely related to that, right now, all the economic incentives for the internet economy are focused on having users generate content, users who don't get paid, and then that content draws people to the platform, and that content can also be used to train AI. Well, if one of the reasons why that economic model is in place goes back to the late 90s with Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and that law blocked internet companies from being liable for things they post on their platform. So, for example, if I wrote something in like the New York Times that was completely false about someone, I could be sued depending on what I said for libel or slander, defamation. But if I post that same thing on Facebook, Facebook can't get sued. They might come after me, but Facebook can't get sued. So right now, these companies have no incentive to look at the veracity of content. Whereas if we got rid of Section 230, and they could be sued for people who posted, defaming or libelous content on their platform, then all of a sudden we would have a different social media. Users would have to be more responsible because the platform wouldn't let them post things. But right now, there's no incentive for those companies to do that.
What about making them like a subscription service or a public utility where, you just do eminent domain and say this is too important for private industry to be running it. We're going to run it as a utility, and you have to subscribe to it if you want to use it, because then there would be no financial incentive for these algorithms to feed people more and more dangerous and divisive content simply to keep their eyeballs on that platform, which is currently what the algorithm, which is a form of AI because it's learning how to engage you with more and more extreme content. And, the previous conversation on this show was, how do we get people to back away from being so angry at people, at each other, to the point where they'll destroy relationships over one comment on the internet? So how do you back away from that? Maybe you disincentivize the algorithm for keeping you there. What do you think?
I completely agree. I think, it's worth reminding the listeners why the point you just made is on point. These tools, the internet, GPS, touchscreen, all these things were developed by public tax dollars through the public university system and the Defense Department in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. So these were already created with public dollars. We made the mistake of allowing commercial entities to take them from our democratic oversight, and I think it's would be a much better use of these technologies to put them back under that democratic oversight. Because right now, like we're talking about the algorithm and what it does, they can change their algorithms at any second in time, and they don't have to tell us what the change is. Only because of whistleblowers, do we know for certain when it changes. So I think bringing more democratic oversight would give us some transparency on those things, which would be critical for how we think about what these tools do.
If you saw the social dilemma, some of these very developers who made these tools don't know how they work anymore because it's kind of gotten away from them. It's taught itself how to keep you watching. And that's creepy as all what. If they don't even know what they made and how it changed over time, that's called, independent learning of not really learning, but it's acquiring certain logic to keep the goal, which is just to keep you there. They don't really care how they keep you. They just want you there because then they can show you lots and lots of ads, which I noticed seem to be increasing to the point where I think maybe people will drop off a lot of these platforms because of the heavy volume of ads. Kind of what happened to commercial radio in the 90s.
Yeah, Tim Wu wrote a great book about this called the Master Switch. But essentially, every time a new communication technology comes out, like radio, television, the internet, people get all excited about it. There's people who use it, for activist movements and to tell narratives that previously have been censored or not told. And then the popularity of it leads commercial entities to get involved. It gets corporatized. The content gets homogenized and pasteurized and sanitized. And then the public leaves it for the next communication tool. And so maybe what you're describing is happening now with the internet in general, but social media in particular, where for a lack of a better analogy, it sort of jumped the shark. And I think we see that in the sense that people are spread out amongst a multitude of platforms. So we don't really have kind of, the one or two platforms where the majority of social media users are at. Instead, they're spread across TikTok and Instagram and Facebook. And so we're actually getting further from where we were, say, in the initial social media platforms, where the majority of social media users were on the same platforms.
Well, getting back to the election, which is coming up, and by the way, the poll that the group that Bill Monig is part of did in California revealed that 84% of California voters were concerned about the dangers that disinformation, deepfakes, and AI pose to the coming election. So we're worried, but what could possibly be done in this 9-month period or whatever is left of this year to moderate or at least account for the heavy hand of these disinformation campaigns on the elections?
I think a lot of it, unfortunately, a lot of the work falls down on users at this point. I mean, even if we a moment ago, you and I were speaking about potential legislation and things like that, as we all know, that takes a long time. And we're talking about, less than 10 months now at this point till the election. So I think one of the things I recommend to users is just to slow down and try not to buy into the big tech hype, which says like, oh, you can do many things at once and you can read everything in a day and have access to boundless information. In reality, you can't. And as a citizen of a democracy, I think it's wise to privilege quality over quantity. And so trying to turn down the knob on the outrage machine and really look at what your priorities are and try to follow news stories that speak to those priorities. And since they are your top priorities, spending the time to look at those news stories to see who's reporting it, what sources do they have. If I'm reading a Democratic leaning source, maybe I should compare it to a Republican just to see. If I'm reading a corporate news source, maybe I should compare it to like an independently funded news source just to see the differences. So I think spending more time with less content, slowing down, suspending judgment, trying not to get mad at others, but listen to them and ask questions and being open to the possibility you might learn something. These are all great steps that folks can take to better position themselves to be, substantial and active and efficient participants in their democracy.
How much do these fact-checking organizations like PolitiFact and Snopes, how much could they help in an election year, verify or not verify? There used to be like a pants on fire rating, and I think that's still there, that PolitiFact gives particular statements. And, we came off of a presidency under Trump where he lied 32,000 times in 4 years, or actually 5, because there was the run-up to his getting elected. I mean, it's just a fire hose. I don't know if these organizations can keep up. It's already, people are getting sort of numb to the lies or the scandal that someone would lie who is running for president.
Look, Trump draws a lot of the attention, and that's by design. That's what Trump wants to do. He thinks any attention is good attention. But let's be honest, all politicians lie. This has been a problem amongst the political class. I think Trump makes himself an easy foil, but the ways in which our politicians lie with impunity or not held accountable is a problem facing our democracy before, since, and after the Trump presidency. But to your question about fact-checking websites, I think I always I don't want to overstate their value, but I think they're a good starting point. We've seen some bias in fact-checking on sites like Snopes and PolitiFact, and of course Media Matters and things historically. But if you're just getting into a topic, or it's the first time you hear about something, going to those websites to look at what they say about it and what's websites or news stories they hyperlink is a great starting point for you to grasp some understanding of the topic or story at hand. I wouldn't, if they say liar, liar, pants on fire, I'm not saying I wouldn't believe it, but I'm just saying I wouldn't just accept it and then repeat it and move on. I would look at it and I would look at the evidence they have to support it. Chances are they're probably right. And that can give you some perspective. So I think they have a good purpose. But to your point, no organization has the resources to keep up with this stuff in real time. So there's still a lot of work that has to be done, unfortunately, at the individual level.
It seems like the kind of stuff Snopes does is mixed in, celebrity statements are mixed in with Supreme Court news. So you have to kind of be selective in what you want to know. Quite often when I ask my students, do you follow the news? They often say, yeah, kind of on social media, but I never watch it, or, the way my mother does on Fox, or the way my dad does on MSNBC. I just look at my social media feed. And I said, so where are you getting information? TikTok. So what is TikTok's role in younger people, digesting news about Gaza, for example? There were a couple statements made in the previous interview that people were, hearing things directly from journalists, but they're also getting some things that were not, you said at the beginning of our interview, that were manufactured. So that's one. Seems like wars in particular are fodder for disinformation, which is intentionally misleading. Misinformation are mistakes that are misinterpreted, but disinformation is propaganda, right?
Correct, and I would here echo the great media scholar Robin Anderson, and she always points out just what you said there, which is, you need lies in war. You're asking people to go commit murder, so you need to legitimize that, and generally that takes a handful of lies to convince people. But your point about audiences getting their news from TikTok and the internet, I'll kind of bridge the generational divide here and say that, the older generation, will watch things like cable news, which I think at this point there's been enough scholarship to say that, the overwhelming majority of it is corporate propaganda and party propaganda. And I wouldn't spend too much time in cable news. And I think young people know that, and that's why they criticize the older generation. But closely related, young people are on corporate platforms that are also moderating content, that also have conflicts of interest, that also have members of political parties on their boards. They also have contracts with governments, including the United States. So it's not like you escape the corporate propaganda by getting on TikTok. You just get it in a more digital form. So I like to say across the age spectrum, we have all sorts of problems. That's the bad news. But the good news, I'll say, is there still are a lot of great journalists in the United States doing great journalism. They typically are doing local journalism, or they're outside of the mainstream. These are like independent journalists, like Abby Martin or Jeremy Scahill does some great work, and folks like that, Manar Mahawish and Alan McLeod. They do some great work. But the difficulty, so the good news is they exist. The difficulty is finding them, and things like Google and social media have suppressed those type of news outlets. So one way that I think, back to your question about the election, one way audiences can inform themselves better, I think, is by gravitating toward these other sources that have great journalists who have a long record of doing great journalism. And following them. And one sign that they're great journalists is they're not afraid to report things that go against the dominant or establishment narrative. Just because you go against that narrative doesn't mean you're right. But when you are right, that is, you have the sources, you're brave enough to do it, that's the sign of a good journalist.
Well, it used to be enough to, the Pentagon Papers used to be enough to bring down whole administrations. We're not sure they have the same impact, that kind of investigative, really hardcore, breaking story type of journalism. And that I always tell my students that is the antidote to misinformation, is follow the really good journalist. If you can figure out who they are and stick with them, that is a great source. I want to end on a couple of questions. We have a couple more minutes here. 2016 Russia interference. Anybody else interfering this time? Or should we be looking outside of our country for bombardment by actors who do not want this country to have a democracy?
Look, all nations, all nations participate in this digital information war, not just Russia, but obviously the United States, Iran, China, go on down the list. All these countries try and use the internet to shape public opinion about their nation and try to insult the image of their enemy. So I don't see that changing. That's been a problem forever. Audiences should be wary of how both foreign and domestic propaganda are influencing the electorate.
Okay, wary we are. What are some other tips, going in, besides the ones you've already mentioned? Any last minute thoughts on where this could all end up? One of my favorite commentators is Maria Reza. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and she has had numerous arrests in the Philippines, but used to work for CNN. She's just always speaking out about this. I don't know if you've heard her speak, but highly recommend her, Maria Reza.
Right. I think, you said one of the tips earlier, and it bears repeating, but, identify good journalists who do good journalism and try to follow them. Try to cut the so-called like junk food news out of your diet, that unnecessary entertainment or commentary. I think at this point, a lot of op-ed writing is kind of not needed. Everybody has a social media account and shares their opinion constantly. So really trying to find people doing journalism and gravitating toward them. Don't just look at the news outlet. So don't become like, I'm a CNN viewer or New York Times reader. Who at the New York Times is doing great journalism? Follow that person. Who at CNN, is doing great journalism? Follow that person.
You want to drop a few names on us before we go? Who is? Who do you like?
I like. I like some of the stuff like a Maggie Haberman does. I think some of the work she does, that tireless journalism. I'll always be a fan of Bernstein and some of the older class there. I still like Cy Hirsch. I know that's controversial. But I also like a lot of the young journalists, too, that I mentioned earlier, like Manar Mahawish and Abby Martin, I think, are money. They're great folks to follow.
Well,
so
Nolan,
following some of those folks are good.
I would love to take your class. I'm glad you can come into mine at UCSC and give a guest lecture. It's been great talking to you. I hope we can call upon you again as we get further into this season.
I hope to chat again. It's been an honor to visit the class, and thank you very much to your audience.
Thank you for being here. That was Nolan Higdon. He is a professor up at UC Santa Cruz in media studies. He joins us here at K-Squid's Talk of the Bay. Coming up next, it's First Person Singular, and after that, it's the Babbleria special. Here tonight, we'll hear about the economy from experts. Lots to look forward to here on K-Squid. This is KSQD Santa Cruz, KSQT Prunedale.